Hello and welcome to Just One Q, the podcast where we explore the latest ideas in workplace belonging in conversation with thought leaders and experts. Each episode, a guest and I dive into a question that highlights their area of expertise. The goal is to leave you with tools and insights you can use to make your workplace better and more human-friendly. I'm your host, Dominique. I'm an inclusion educator and advocate working for Dialectic, a workplace learning consultancy in lovely Guelph, Ontario, which is situated on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional lands of the Chinooktun and Haudenosaunee peoples. On today's episode, we will be discussing the question, what changes when we lead with trauma sensitivity? And with me to answer this question today is Adriana Leigh. Adriana is the lead consultant at ALG Consulting, where her work is centered on building safe, respectful, and inclusive workplaces. She draws on a unique blend of 20 years of diverse global experience as a workplace human rights lawyer and facilitator in gender equality, the prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, gender-based violence prevention, and diversity and inclusion. She has vast experience working globally with the United Nations, universities, as well as the nonprofit and private sectors. Adriana is also the author of a brand new book called Trauma Sensitivity at Work, which I have my little copy here. And it draws on her work across policy, leadership, and organizational systems. So welcome to the show, Adriana.
Hi, Dom. Great to be here.
So glad to have you on. We have a lot to cover because you've written this amazing book. So I want to dive right in, but I hope that we can just start sort of with the basics. And then I'm sure you've been asked to do this 1,000 times since your book came out in every conversation, but maybe you can just start by describing, what is trauma and what might it look like in ourselves and in others?
Great. A great first step, because I don't want to assume, right? For a lot of people that may be new to the topic. It's a little bit intimidating for some people, so I'll spell it out for you. A lasting emotional response to a distressing event is often how it's described. Importantly, I want to emphasize, it's not just what happens to us, but what happens inside of us. And I cite Gabor Mate, who's done a lot of research, physician and a trauma specialist on that. So let's think of it not only as, say, the car crash, but the injury that sustains within our body, psychologically, biologically, emotionally over time from that crash. And it can overwhelm our nervous system's ability to cope, and it gets stored in our body, sometimes long after the original event, especially in environments where it is not safe to process structurally, culturally, institutionally.
And I mean, you sort of use the analogy of a car crash, and that is what we think of as, a really traumatic event, but not everybody has a car crash. I'm wondering, how common is trauma?
Yes, very. One statistic that I cite from the WHO is that 70% of the people experience some form of trauma in their lifetime. And I would venture to say, Dom, that that's an understatement because that's based on reporting, right? And understanding. So odds are most people listening have some. And the spectrum of it matters. I think importantly, you had mentioned, the car crash that I referred to. That's often what many folks who are new to this terminology think of, right? And the spectrum matters. So it's not just a big T. For example, war, disaster, assault, trauma. These are things that we think of. Mm-hmm. We can talk about small t, and that's not to diminish it, but it's a term that Gabor Mate uses, or complex trauma, chronic criticism, neglect, abandonment, ongoing oppression as well, which relates to our talks about DEI. Mm-hmm. They can have equal or greater impact on our system over time. And there's also vicarious trauma, absorbing someone else's suffering, very big in the world of those who are DEI practitioners, advocacy. We absorb or experience the suffering of others, and intergenerational trauma, which many of us have for many different reasons.
Yeah, vicarious trauma also makes me think of all the healthcare workers out there who are witnessing the suffering of others constantly all day.
Yes.
And just having to absorb that and cope in systems that are really difficult.
Totally.
Yeah. So if everybody has this, is there a way that we can pinpoint it or recognize it in ourselves or in others?
Yeah, I think we've heard of the word triggers, right? It's a colloquialism, but I want to spell it out for us. Most of us have that when our nervous system is, what I say, activated, or sometimes it can be up here, sometimes when you're feeling up in the fight or flight. And generally a trigger could be a smell, a sound, a situation you might have even in the workplace that you feel flooded or overwhelmed with feelings when the current moment may not actually present the amount of danger that your body is recording. So what I talk a lot about in the book is that patterns that are well honed and sometimes embraced in some workplace cultures, like perfectionism, like what we call people pleasing, difficulty trusting, shutting down in conflict. We see that a lot in teams. Inability to even celebrate wins, which I've had a lot with people I work with. These may indicate something chronic or deeper is going on. Right. And with trauma, you may also have some chronic physical symptoms that pop up. Not always, but trauma survivors do more disproportionately have, chronic pain, chronic tension, migraines, and these things make sense if you've been bracing your body, your muscles physically for years. It's going to biologically affect the wiring inside. And most importantly, I think important to remember that if I have a reaction that might feel disproportionate to what's in front of me, that's worth checking in with curiosity around whether there may be a trauma response that's playing into that.
Right.
And one reframe that I think is really important that I talk a lot about in the book, trauma responses, whether we've got fight or flight, which people know more about in the vernacular, but there's also freeze when, you're not able to do anything, your mind goes blank, or fawn, which many people may call people pleasing, but this urge to appease, to feel safe. It was a survival mechanism, right? So none of these are character flaws. They were these survival strategies that we as humans adapted to based on our circumstances, our environment. And the snag is that they don't always know those threat responses. They don't know when the threat is actually gone. So they pop up in the workplace.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that reframe. And checking in with our colleagues or noticing when we see those disproportionate reactions, I think is like such a good tell, because often that's the thing that we notice about other people mostly is like, what was that about? Why did they respond in that way? It wasn't a big deal, or they overreacted. That can be the sense that we have of somebody else. Often we don't see it in ourselves, but it's, I think, easier to spot in some other people sometimes, for sure. So, Adriana, your background is in human rights law and then in sexual violence, sexual harassment prevention consulting for organizations. So I'm curious, just in terms of your journey, when did you start to notice that the tools that you were using to address trauma in those organizational contexts had a broader applicability for, all workplaces and leaders within them?
Yeah, great question. I think I started noticing that over time, that these frameworks that I was developing with clients to support, say, survivors of sexual harassment or sexual violence, they seemed to have a wider applicability to the issues I was seeing in teams that I was working with on other issues, right? Freeze responses in difficult conversations or conflict, like I said. High conflict situations where there was constant standstill, where I could see that there were these heightened reactions to what was going on that caught them at an impasse. And I also connected some of these frameworks I was using to my own experiences leading teams. And once I saw it in myself, and then in the teams I was working with, it's like you can't unsee something that you start seeing, right? So then I started seeing it much more and applying this lens to the workplace dynamics around me and working with my clients with some of these tools, and it was landing, right? And I'll give you one tool that seems to hit home for a lot of folks from the book. It's a tool called I Hear You, I Don't Hear You. And it was a tool that I originally developed to train leaders on responding to disclosures of sexual harm, say sexual harassment at work. And it was really to help managers and HR folks avoid the common reaction of victim blaming, right? Or minimizing, right? Or, oh, you're overreacting, right? These kinds of common responses that we have for many reasons. And I realized that this tool, among others, really applied principles that more generally apply to how you work out conflict in teams, for example. And for example, applying tools of active listening. A lot of this I hear you, don't hear you is also active listening, which I know you do with your clients as well at Dialectic. So there was a much more broader applicability. And that's the feedback I've actually been getting from folks and readers on tools like I hear you, I don't hear you, even in interpersonal interactions or colleague disputes that you have. A lot of these tools apply to our daily interactions at work.
Yeah. So interesting that you've caught this sort of way to generalize it and that it happened naturally, like just that the tools resonated and that's the thing that made it stick. Yeah, really interesting. And of course, the language of trauma isn't necessarily mainstream in the workplace. So, the work that you're doing is normalizing also, right?
Yes, exactly. I want to normalize this idea of trauma because if at least 70% of us have it, it belongs in every conversation we have about leadership, every conversation we have about managing conflict. It's an undercurrent of everything. And often trauma and the trauma-informed work, and we'll talk about language in a minute, has really been siloed often into crisis contexts. And I worked in those environments with, say, humanitarian organizations or healthcare, for example. It's also been siloed into therapy offices. And these are all important spaces to work through trauma. Survivor support groups is another space where the language of trauma exists and is more familiar. But as I said, if 70% of us are carrying it, it belongs in all the conversations. And the language of trauma doesn't need to be gatekept there, because when people hear fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, many folks recognize themselves. And the workplace can be a very triggering place. And they recognize more than we would like that these reactions can be the source of some of the conflict. But if they're the source, they can actually be the source of and solution if we can recognize them in ourselves and our teams.
Absolutely. Let's get down to some of that language. I want to dive into that. We often hear that term trauma informed, again, not so much at work, but maybe more in therapy contexts and things like that. But you've chosen to write a book about trauma sensitivity in the workplace. So what is the difference there? And why did you choose the language of sensitivity instead of, informed?
Okay. Right. Well, before I get into the more technical reasons for the choice, I will say I was very strong about reclaiming the term sensitivity because you as well work on soft skills. And I want to reclaim that word as well. It's not a soft skill, right? Sensitivity is something to be honed in, I think is an important skill for any inclusive leader. So that's one of the reasons. Generally, on the language choice, I'll go back to what trauma informed means. Generally, trauma informed, it's important. I use all of those principles in the trauma sensitivity work that I do, but informed has been applied in a way that has a checkbox quality to it. It can be applied that way. I took the training. I have the certificate. And also in more of a cognitive, I know about the trauma. I learned about it, so I'm done, right? But you can be informed about trauma and still run a workplace or a team that re-traumatizes people every day in your behavior and in your culture. So what sensitivity means, for me, it's about attunement. It's something you're practicing in micro moments, right? Continuously. It lives in how we deliver feedback. It's how we open a difficult meeting, how we respond when someone's, previously very engaged starts going quiet in our team. And we don't get that from one training. It's embodied. And this isn't a woo-woo term. I really do mean it embodied in how we act with each other every day at work, not just intellectual. So there's a difference between knowing what a freeze response is. Oh, I know I can recognize it, which is an important first step. And then adjusting as a manager, as a leader, as an HR personnel member, when you see that in action and the language to use. And this is really important. Trauma sensitivity, to me, it's not just a clinical practice. It's not reserved for people diagnosed with a trauma history. It's not just for therapists, and it doesn't ask us to become therapists at work. It's something that benefits everyone, right? Even if someone has never experienced, say, a big T trauma, right? I have a nervous system. You have a nervous system, Dom. We all do. We're all operating in nervous systems in an organization, and we have stress responses. And we all have moments where we're operating outside our window of tolerance, right? Our window of tolerance being, where our nervous system is in the prime kind of way to space or zone where you can handle adversity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? right? Exactly. Like we're not always there, but we're often out of it. So we all have that experience at work. So again, the goal isn't to turn any of us into therapists. It's to help us become more attuned leaders to ourselves and to our teams. And yeah, I think that's where we'll
Yeah,
leave that for now.
absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I mean, we talked about what trauma looks like for an individual person, but I want to expand that now. And maybe you can give us a few more examples of how this actually shows up in the workplace in case people are having a hard time connecting like experiences of trauma on the individual level and how it's up on teams, for example.
Yes, exactly. It can show up on teams. It can show up in the culture. It can show up on an organizational level, right? So I'll give you an example. So a team conflict, right, which is what I referred to before. In high pressure environments, I work with a lot of clients that work in, say, healthcare or work in different environments that are high stress. More and more these days, we're facing uncertainty, layoffs, AI, and these can all create a lot of a heightened kind of nervous system. And what might look like a personality clash in these moments of uncertainty or performance issue is often many nervous systems in conflict, right? So nobody's necessarily being difficult per se, although the conflict may be so. We may be activated, right? So it gives a different lens to the conflict. And I've worked with health leaders, for example, from really diverse backgrounds. And what struck me was that the same interaction or dynamic could land differently for different people with different experiences, also from different cultures, a tone of voice, a dismissive tone. For one person, it rolls off. For one person, that change can be quite activating. And then to add to it around DEI, when identity, race, gender, seniority, age can be at the root of our conflict, the stakes feel existential to us, not just professional. And that activates trauma responses in a very special way in ordinary, everyday workplaces where people may think it's an overreaction, but it's really hitting very close to home for very many folks.
Yeah, I think it's, that when we have experiences, I think we've all had that feeling. Somebody says something or behaves in a way, and it's a lot about who we are showing up in that room that can
Mm-hmm.
trigger past experiences, or you have this cumulative sense of being threatened by an identity or whatever, and that can just make things explosive that otherwise would
Exactly.
be easy to work out.
Explosive. I
Yeah.
think explosive is a good way. That's actually a good kind of an orange flag, I'd say,
Mhm.
Dom. If you've got explosions, that's definitely something to look at in terms of behavior.
Mhm.
Especially one of the things to spot is when there's a real change in behavior, right? Engaged to disengaged, starting to miss things that you didn't miss before, right? And you don't need someone to tell you their history. You can see also the rhythm, the cadence of which somebody speaks or doesn't speak, right? Some people might have a hypervigilance, which is a sure sign of a trauma response, right? Tracking every micro expression.
Mhm.
Micromanagement can sometimes be, I would argue, a proxy for that,
Oh,
right?
interesting.
Yeah, it can be. We can get into that later, but there's definitely research on that as well. And on the opposite, people and teams can go very flat, very agreeable, agree very quickly. And this may be a fawn response in action to high conflict situations. It can look like professionalism, and it's actually been given a badge sometimes, the agreeable one. It isn't always, especially
Mhm.
for us as women.
Mhm.
And I think one thing I want to name that pops up in the workplace is how leaders actually respond to trauma responses, right? I think it leads to what you were saying earlier. When we see it in others, our default reaction may be to, oh, wow. Like instead of, oh, wow, what's that about in terms of curiosity, our first default may be judgment, right? Like, what is that about? I mean, we're all human. And that shows up and pops up a lot with managers, particularly in cases where you may be naming something that's traumatic at work to a manager, to a team leader. You hear you're just exaggerating, you're too sensitive. This really replicates often the original injury that somebody had, right?
Right.
And there's a lot of research on that. And tell someone the reality isn't real. So that's just a really important thing I want to name that I think managers often do. And there's a lot of tools in the book to kind of counter that. And when you're more attuned to the trauma responses you see popping up, you're less likely, I think, to use that kind of language, that dismissive language.
Mm.
And then the organizational body and the team develops trauma responses as well, almost collectively. I worked with teams that have gone through brutal restructuring. This is more familiar these days. Sudden leadership changes can be very activating. public scandals. I've worked with organizations that have that, reputational issues. They can all leave this residue. You can see that this hint of change on the team can elicit these heightened, maybe not explosive, these heightened responses, right? Especially those who've had volatility in their own lives, right? And then sometimes it's in the atmosphere of the team, right? Everyone's performing fine, they're hitting their numbers, but they're disengaged. Nobody says what they actually think. Nobody trusts that good news is real. People react very quickly to others. And these are all signs that a culture is collectively kind of holding that trauma response.
I love that hypervigilance piece. It's so real. I've been in workplaces personally too, where there have been layoffs and teams get broken up, and it does take a long time, and not just time, but intention to heal from that type of hit. And it can be scary to take next steps or take risks or be creative as a team after something like that has happened.
Yeah.
So what does, you've given a couple of examples already of what trauma sensitivity means in practice, but I'm wondering if you can maybe give us a few more tidbits of what we can reasonably do in our workplaces.
Sure. I think one thing is that it starts with self-awareness, right? And I've got this model that starts with regulation. And I don't mean rules, I mean emotional regulation.
For sure.
It's often overlooked piece in any leadership seminar. It's just starting to be something that we're talking about. It begins with a leader doing some of their own work. You can't attune to someone else on the team or their nervous system if you don't know anything about your own. This doesn't mean you have to be a therapist to yourself or to your team. It's not about being healed before you can lead others completely, because who knows what healed means in the end, right?
Yeah.
We're all healing. It's about developing the self-awareness to notice when something other than the present moment might be driving your reaction. So that helps you lead better, and it helps you address what's in front of you. And so we talk a lot about emotional intelligence. And I think we often skip what I see as a foundational layer to this, which is, why do certain situations push our buttons? And we can be locked in to the button pushing part if we don't take that beat, that step before. And we can't be emotionally agile, as Susan David says, or emotionally intelligent when we're locked into that and we're dysregulated, right? So it's really about taking stock first, regulating yourself so that you can then become aware of what's going on around you, and so that you can respond in a way where the trauma response doesn't run the show, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, is the self-awareness. And you can start to recognize the context only when you become aware of what's going on inside you.
That makes complete sense. And, it's kind of like an extension of emotional intelligence, maybe, or other concepts that people are familiar with in leadership. I have had, occasion to sort of dip my toes into that world as well, with training related to that in certain organizations. And it feels like the foundation. Like, you can't really engage people if you're not self-aware, if you don't have an idea of why something would bother you, or like you're just so much more open to unnecessary conflict or reactivity if you haven't kind of checked in with yourself and settled down and, questioned why something is the matter, like why something is not wrong with the situation, but wrong with your reaction to the situation, possibly.
Yeah. Or maybe I would reframe even, we're not wrong, but maybe it's maladapted, or, hey, maybe it's not working, or like, what's not working? Often I react in ways like, what's not working about my reaction in this situation? Like, it doesn't match,
Yeah.
So I see thanks for naming that, emotional intelligence. This is kind of just the next branch, so to speak, of that conversation. I think it just adds to that conversation. It adds a layer of nuance and a layer of awareness and more tools that folks can access to become more aware leaders.
Absolutely. So beyond self-awareness, what's next? Like, what else can we do within our workplaces?
Right. So then I think the next step, I often like to say, is then I can start recognizing what's in the room. I can start recognizing the context, right? And taking stock of what's around me. And I've got quite a few tools in one of the chapters where leaders can really first take stock of what's going on within them, and then start to scan the environment and figure out what kind of situation is this, to figure out how to respond rather than react, right? So I've got a 4-step process that can go through in the book about regulating, recognizing the context, including the power dynamics, the safety, your intention, what you know about the person you're connecting with or not. There are various factors to look at in terms of the context to then be able to have what I call response agility and figure out how you want to respond as a leader. And then, of course, finally, you're reflecting what worked, what didn't work. And it's this iterative process that goes around and around. So, and there's various things that in each of those 4 steps, it's like a framework of what you can do. But basically, that helps you, I think, be able to respond to many different situations in a different way, right? And then you'll be able to start extending this awareness, I think, to others. Like I said at the top of the hour, the more I saw it in myself, the more I could start extending grace and seeing it in others. So I was like, oh, okay, maybe there's something else going on with what's happening with Dom, you know? Yeah. Or anyone else, not to target you. Nothing's happening with you, Dom. Just, I know you're in front of me. You're good.
I'm great.
Yeah, exactly. So I think just to make it concrete, I'll give just a couple more examples to make sure that it's concrete for folks, right? Meeting hygiene is a term that I really like, is a good example. Do we know what's coming? I think that surprises can be surprisingly activating for folks in the workplace, right? So sending an agenda in advance of a difficult meeting, flagging that a difficult topic is on the table, sometimes, not always. We can get into nuances in another podcast, but sometimes I think that's important. It respects how nervous systems work and gives people prep time, right? Performance evaluations too, like knowing what folks know what to expect, right? And I would argue having more transparent conversations more often than one big performance evaluation, which is starting to be talked about in HR, is also more trauma sensitive because more transparent communication builds trust over time, right? And often folks who've experienced trauma, they were betrayed or they can't trust people because they were betrayed by the people that they trusted. So building regular transparent communication about how things are going is a simple, not always easy practice. It also extends to how we give feedback, right? Ambushing someone with critical feedback in a public setting can be very activating, and it's very common. And it also is often surprisingly ineffective for a lot of folks, right? And then finally, how we start meetings can make or break the meetings, right? Do we drop straight into the business? We often do, right? Letting people have, say, just 60 seconds just to arrive, right? It normalizes, I think, letting our nervous system settle in a meeting before getting into the business.
I love that. And, a lot of these practical things that you're suggesting sound like they would really benefit people who are neurodivergent or have other disabilities. This is something that we've talked about on this show quite a bit. Yeah. And I'm wondering, do you see that connection there?
Deeply. And I'm very happy that you raised it. I say deeply because there's a personal component to me. I identify as neurodivergent. And I think that's shaped how I understand this intersection, I think, in a more visceral way. So if we move through the world with a brain that works a little differently, and you spent years feeling unseen or misunderstood at work and in relationships, that can accumulate. So that's not just inconvenience, that can actually stay in the body as complex trauma within itself. So there you go with a very prime intersection, right? Another important thing is disclosure of disability in the workplace is potentially traumatic at work. I work a lot on policies, right, and complaints processes, or I work with others on, say, accommodation policies. And I think it doesn't get a lot of attention that the act of disclosing, even if you've got a policy, can be traumatic and very scary for folks. You're being asked to reveal something vulnerable and you're not sure that it's a safe environment to do so, right? So when practitioners gravitate towards trauma-sensitive communication, it's not accidental in these spaces of accommodation at work. It's to create the foundation for safety to come forward and to be able to disclose. So that's trauma sensitivity in action. When you have a reporting process, an accommodation policy, where you have managers that are trained to be sensitive in the way they receive people, I think that's a really important piece here. And then importantly, trauma itself in the body can manifest those mental health conditions at work.
Right.
I speak a lot about that, right? Physical, neurological, that require workplace accommodation, anxiety, chronic pain, depression. So that's another really important link. So the clinical lens and the trauma lens are always in conversation with each other. And of course, a manager who understands trauma sensitivity and they respond with, I hear you, rather than I don't hear you, for example, it's going to make all the difference in terms of how that employee is received and actually ultimately whether they stay or go from the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah. That response to disclosure piece is something that I've also done some training around in various contexts. And it's like, just thanking the person for disclosing, I feel like is such a nice first step. I'm just going to throw that out there because it's something that I think does require risk taking on the part of the person doing the disclosing.
Yes.
And just thanking and then asking them, what is it that you need me to know? And just being like having a sense of genuine curiosity toward that type of disclosure can be so disarming and really turn it around from being something scary to, I am here, I appreciate this, and now I need you to just tell me everything that I need to know. What is it that you want me to know? And
Love that.
it's up to the person to then, set what they think they are willing to share.
Exactly. I love that, Dom. Thanks also for naming some easy to use language for folks, like a script. Even that, when you said thank you, it's like my shoulders went down. Like even that in of itself can frame the conversation and open it up. And what I love that you said too, Dom, is that when you say, what do you need me to know? You then give agency to the other person, which is a really important trauma sensitive principle, is giving a person agency and choice, because it's often been taken away. So giving them choice in what and how to disclose and share is very empowering.
Absolutely. So for HR leaders who are listening, I'm just wondering, do you advocate for kind of formalizing trauma sensitivity into organizational policy? Like there are all these little things that we can do at an interpersonal level, but I'm wondering if that's your approach, if you think that this should be worked into policy.
Okay, well, a very simple answer is yes, of course. And I have a whole chapter on that. I work a lot on organizational policies, but there are various ways we can do it. I very much am a proponent of start where you are, right? So, what I would say to HR leaders is we already often have policies. I have developed policies for folks, but often it's a question of revising or retweaking them with this lens in mind, right? So the question is whether we're accidentally creating conditions for re-traumatization, like we said, in the way we implement our policies. That's often where I see the gap. So formalization does matter, but it's not necessarily where I'd start. Where I'd start is where you are, and actually applying this lens is flexible enough to be applied to where folks are and kind of help them map out over the course of what they've got, what they might need to rejig in their policies.
Right.
Right. That's often what I've done.
Right.
Yeah.
So this could look like a bit of an audit or, taking.
It could.
Yeah.
It could look like an audit. There are organizations practitioners that do a more fulsome organizational audit around trauma-informed practices, processes, of course. I would argue you don't necessarily have to start there. I believe that I would like to give the clients I work with more agency in the process, rather than having to see this as a specialty that is not at all accessible to them. Right. So let's start where we are. And one of the accessible entry points is bringing this lens to reviews you're already doing. A lot of us are doing exit interviews. A lot of us are doing engagement surveys. That's a big one. Pulse surveys, accommodation request patterns, right? Those kinds of things, complaints processes. How many complaints do we receive? Having none is often a signal to look at it, right? Just to give a sense of some of those policies that we could review. And then asking, what does this data really tell us about the safety and the implementation of our policies, right? So sometimes it's not just we need new data and a whole new set of tools, but it's asking some questions about the data we have, right? So policies are really important. They're kind of like the floor, right? It matters. But as we said, like trauma sensitivity is in those micro moments and also the way we implement the policies, right?
Yeah. And then if there's something that like is honed in on in that sort of basic scan, or when we're looking at our information and we want to make a change, how do you best roll that out within an organization, like a change toward more trauma sensitive practice?
How we could roll it out? Well, it could be, I would argue, one model, because I've worked a lot with clients on this in a very iterative, almost design thinking way, that organizations can do a pilot.
Okay.
Sometimes I've done something like that. I've worked with a team, for example, or there's two. I've worked with a team or teams that are committed to changing culture and introducing some concrete changes, right? Meeting hygiene, team guidelines to build safety, et cetera, and giving a structured way to report back to senior leadership. And I've done that. I'll give you an example, which was really effective with one gender equality team where we created a safer space for women. And we tracked the data over time. It was this micro pilot. And we found some very concrete HR results in terms of also the gaps in benefits, for example, in professional development for women, things that were really important for retention, things were really important for leadership to know. And we were able to take those results and share them with the wider team and actually with the donors of a larger project that was part of the government larger project. So I think smaller team trials can become bigger. That's one way of doing it. One other entry point I'll say is that I often work with organizations and HR leaders without a big budget, but that they want to revise their policy. So there's one chapter where I talk about the principles with which you can revise your policies. And I have a sort of a simple step process: safety, acknowledgement, support. I call them the SAS principles. They sound simple, but they're a lens with which you can revise some of your policies. Particularly your complaints processes. Okay. That's where I say you need to look at, right? Yeah. Because that's often where the re-traumatization happens, when people come forward and you don't know how to act. So safety means someone can come forward without being feared that they'll be made the problem from an emotional safety perspective, that their job, also their relationships, their reputation won't be collateral damage for coming forward, right? Sure. Acknowledgement is underrated. People don't come forward primarily because they think they'll get punished or that they'll have their experience not recognized, right? Or we go to straight to fix it mode without that I hear you moment and that I thank you moment that you cited earlier. I thank you, right? And then support means you're not just processing something that comes forward as a complaint, you also offer the support. Do they know what resources are available? Is someone checking in? Expert support is often needed in some situations and not for HR to do alone. It could be therapy, it could be medical intervention, et cetera. Yeah. And do we have that accessible to folks?
Well, this is great. I mean, you've given us a ton of, this is a clear sort of starting point or some things that are actionable that people can look at within their organizations. And to me, this is such an important part of this conversation because it can feel up in the clouds. Like we can talk about trauma in a way that feels a little abstracted or lives in therapy land. And you've kind of taken it down and certainly in your book have made it operationalized in a way, like not that it lives in policy, it is interpersonal, but I think people do need to have those steps and tools. And I think that that's what your book has done really well. So thank you for sort of orienting us there. And just to follow up on that, like a lot of managers or leaders might say, I'm a manager, not a therapist. And they might think that trauma sensitivity as a lens even like might ask too much or go too far or like cross some weird boundary. What do you say to that?
Great. That's one of the largest questions I get, Dom. So first thing I'll say is no one's asking you to be a therapist at all, right? So trauma sensitivity, I call it a leadership skill the same way conflict resolution or giving feedback would be, right? The clinical work belongs with clinicians, right? What belongs with leaders is awareness of our responses and how the environment affects the people that are on your team. That, I would say, Dom, is in therapy, that's management.
Yes.
Right? So some leaders may resist this framing, right? They often may be the ones whose responses are already doing damage. I wouldn't, look, I'm not going to pathologize, but know that they may actually be paying for it in terms of interpersonal conflict and turnover on their teams.
Right.
Right? When you resist the fact that this actually is already alive in the teams that you're working with, it's just becoming attuned to it. So sometimes when we say, I'm not a therapist, it can be an avoidance mechanism, like to avoid doing that self-awareness, emotional awareness piece that we need to be an effective leader and to move the needle with your team with issues that are happening. Yeah. Right. And trauma sensitivity, it's important that I mention this, doesn't ask us to know our employees' histories.
Okay.
I got this question at one of my book launches. It doesn't ask us, we don't ask about disclosure. We're not guessing who the 70% is. That's the antithesis of the argument, right? We're not making assumptions about people's experience or probe into their personal lives. It asks us to create larger structural conditions where people can all do their best work, regardless of what we're carrying. And all of us are carrying something. That's what I would say. So we're not treating the trauma. That's not our job as an HR manager, as a leader. We're just stopping the unnecessary amplification of it. And it's generalized, right? So the practices that help someone with a known trauma history, which may be disclosed, clear communication, advance notice, team behavioral guidelines, consistent, transparent feedback, don't they just make our teams better? I would argue yes.
Yeah.
And I think one thing I wanted to say, and I posted on this and it spread like wildfire, is the concern that trauma sensitivity goes too far.
Right.
It can come from a place of imagining a workplace where everyone is fragile.
Yeah.
Everything is handled with, excessive care, and hard conversations can happen. I've heard that argument. That's not what this is. I think that's often misinterpretation, misunderstanding of trauma sensitivity. That's actually the opposite of what this is. I would say that the workplaces that are afraid of trauma sensitivity or afraid of what they'll create can be the ones where people are already tiptoeing around dysregulated leaders. Around leaders that are slamming doors. The workplace already exists with these kinds of dynamics, right? A team is walking on eggshells around that. They're not being fragile. They're rationally responding, or they're responding to a situation, right? So they've learned that someone's emotional state is, we have to organize ourselves around that. That's the eggshells. So trauma sensitivity is actually a balm. It's a lens that can help that kind of dynamic in a team and help us work through that conflict so we can work more effectively. So I want to ask folks, when you tell me too far, I often have this conversation, it's gone too far. Too far compared to what, right? Compared to what, right? The alternative isn't a high-performing culture necessarily. It can be a culture of hypervigilance, conflict avoidance, unspoken truths, which the research supports that can lead to costly conflict and ultimately turnover, which costs a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it is a cultural moment right now. Like, we are sort of seeing a cultural swing back toward rewarding more emotional reactivity and kind of like tough leadership. There's a lot of obviously it's tied to feminism and the pendulum swinging back and forth on that as well. I'm wondering, has this had any impact on how your message is being received?
Well, I'll name the moment, honestly. Okay. I'm with you. I can feel it. Yeah. A lot of people are working in this space are, performing toughness, treating emotional awareness as weakness. What I would say is that the current might be loud, but that doesn't mean that it's right, or it doesn't mean that's necessarily the only voice. It's just that it's loud. Loud is the observation, right? It's not new, though. It doesn't mean right. It doesn't mean new. It doesn't mean that the pendulum hasn't swung before. And the research, the human cost, the organizational wreckage of not being sensitive, there's research to support that, and that doesn't change, right? But based on what's loudest right now. Yeah. And I would say that who the book is for, primarily, I want to be honest, this book isn't necessarily to drag the ones who are the most skeptical across, reluctantly across the finish line. The main people I did write this for feel something, right? They want to lead better. The HR practitioners who are exhausted that have written me, managers who went home after a hard conversation and said oh, that could have gone better and I need some new tools. So these are a couple of the people that I'm building with. And particularly folks that are in DEI, I think we're thirsty for something that we can build towards, right? And we've talked a lot about what we're against in DEI, and it's important. I think the next iteration of that is let's build a movement towards something more positive and more sensitive, humane culture. And I think trauma sensitivity is part of that conversation. It's a vision that we can work towards together. Yeah. And one thing I'll say that I've been thinking about, when I see pushback, I'm now trying to welcome it. Right? The way I see it, this wasn't an important conversation to be having. It wouldn't elicit any reactions. So I'm trying to understand pushback from a perspective of the other. I'm challenging some well-worn leadership paradigms, and that can be activating for folks who may be committed to those frameworks. And I also want to recognize that we're all at different places in our leadership journey, our understanding, the paradigms that we've worked with, our own healing as well, our own experiences. So some who may start more skeptical may be able to integrate this over time, especially when they see its benefits.
Sure.
And that's also why I included a chapter around the business case. Reluctantly, but I knew it was very important for champions to have a chapter on why these can be very important strategies and why, from a bottom line perspective, they are not as hard to sell to leadership as we think they may be. So there's a whole chapter on that for folks.
Nice. And I mean, I'm sure that your book is probably drawing out all of these people who do find the message really compelling. What's that been like? Has there been a bit of a groundswell around you of support?
There has been, and surprisingly, there's been interesting, I'd say, categories of people, surprising categories of people coming to me, sending DMs. There's been practitioners. There's been those working even in social work. There's been a lot of employees. That's something I didn't anticipate. So they're seeing something in their own experience reflected back that they may be the future managers, or they've faced the environment. That's something unexpected. And I've seen a lot of leaders in space, the targets have come to me, people particularly in the DEI space, right. HR leaders, people and culture managers. There's been a lot of that kind of, I recognize this, but there's been some comments that it gives it a language.
Yes.
That's what I've gotten, gives it kind of a language or a framework of some of the things that people have been sensing before. Absolutely. That's been the most common, I think, feedback I've gotten.
Yeah. I'm not surprised it's resonating with DEI folks, obviously. I'm wondering, do you see this trauma sensitivity work as part of DEI?
100%. Okay. It's not just connected to DEI. It might be the missing piece that explains why some DEI work stalls. There's inclusion right there in the title, how to build safe, inclusive teams, and it's there for a reason. We can't talk seriously about inclusion without talking about whose experiences have been invalidated, whose bodies have carried the weight of that. Discrimination in and of itself creates a mix of trauma, of complex trauma that people hold in their bodies. And it shows up in environments that weren't necessarily built with them in mind, right? So it has everything to say about it. And I think Resmaa Menakem works a lot on this. And he talks about how racial trauma, for example, isn't just psychological or cognitive, it lives in our body. And that's why we can't think our way out of racial discrimination. We have to acknowledge the trauma responses that we have in our bodies, right? And where it actually lives, both with those who are, Black-bodied that face white supremacy and those who are white who have our own fear responses in our bodies that I think we can't necessarily think our way out of. And I think that paradigm applies very broadly to DEI initiatives, right? That the DEI work often stalls when we talk about how bias trainings only take us so far, right? We're going towards the cognitive, it doesn't lead to behavioral change. Yes, I think all of that's really important. And this trauma sensitivity piece is an added layer where we understand that a lot of these senses of who we are, our identity, they live in our body, right? And so that's this like missing layer. So I think when DEI work engages with this kind of framework more seriously, we can make more headway. It's an added part of the conversation, just like it adds to the emotional intelligence conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such an unspoken and powerful thing that you've tapped in here, like not just this intellectual piece. We sometimes talk about these concepts like they're purely intellectual, but thinking about them as embodied, thinking about them as related to nervous systems can help us understand why things fall flat when you're, in a room or trying to push some sort of inclusion program or whatever. Like people's resistance isn't up here. It's
in here. And so this is where resistance can be a trauma response in and of itself.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think this lens can help people understand and navigate that resistance in DEI.
That's great. Yeah. So what is the hope then that you're offering to people who feel kind of overwhelmed by the current state of work?
Okay, I'll go back to the folks who've been writing me. There's a lot of them, and the people are out there. And I continue to work throughout all this time, throughout the backlash, and as does your team, Dom. We continue to work with folks who are committed to the work, whether the language changes or not. And I work with them, and they're not fringed. A lot of the people I work with are in rooms that matter. Their voices may be less loud, but we're still there doing the work.
Yeah.
A lot of the folks I work with are people and culture managers making hiring decisions and that are starting to apply these lenses. And they're doing this every day and quietly over time, implementing these things and showing their leaders over time the results. So this is what I call like a scaffolded over time change that I tell people is there. It is there, right? So honestly, I'll say again, the fact that there may be a swing back tells me this work landed and we don't get backlash against something that doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So resistance is in a strange way evidence that we're making an impact. So you can hold both things, right? That this moment is serious. We've got a lot of resistance and let's not cede our vision, right? And forget about all the people quietly doing the work behind the scenes every day.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. Adriana Leigh, thank you so much for sharing about this important topic and for giving us this fantastic book. It's a very nice antidote for all of the tough leadership rhetoric that is resurfacing and swirling right now. And it is such a nice extension to those topics like emotional intelligence that are important, but could use like a little bit of a wake up, and healthy conflict and neuroinclusion and all these other things that are sort of, it just ties everything together so nicely. So it's just a wonderful gift. If you're curious about Adriana and her book, Trauma Sensitivity at Work, please check out the links in the show notes. And is there anywhere else that people should be following you, Adriana?
Sure. Well, they can feel free to go on my website, www.algconsulting.ca,
Okay.
and /book, and that'll give you the book. But you can also just check out my work more generally. LinkedIn, feel free. And Dom, I figure you'll put the links in the show notes. And
I sure will.
Folks.
Absolutely.
Okay,
and for our listeners, you can also always get in touch with me and let me know what you think of today's episode or share any suggestions or guests. And if you like what you're hearing, we deeply appreciate a quick follow or review wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Dominique. Thank you so much for listening and see you next time on Just One Q.